There's a widely accepted notion that these days across the globe, it's men who don't want marriage, right? Look at North America, look at least the Anglophone country of the UK, look at the grass eaters of Japan. So men don't want to get married. Okay. There's a little bit more to this story than just men not wanting to get married. So I thought I'd have a look and a discussion of the decline of marriage in Asia. As many of you know, I spent a couple of years in South Korea way back, and I'm more familiar with the other Asian cultures than most people are, I'd argue. And I want to look at it from a different cultural perspective. I mean, to those who believe that I think there are no such thing as cultural differences, well, here's the proof otherwise. Of course, there are cultural differences. It's just all this harks back to the same. All these differences hark back to the same biological origins. Ultimately, it's just variants, basically. Yeah. But anyway, the difference in East Asian countries, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, is really quite profound to Western countries. There is a very similar decline in marriage, but it's not really for all too similar reasons. They're only partially similar. And believe it or not, if you look at the data, it's more women who don't want to get married than men in East Asian countries. Whereas in the United States and Canada, the UK, that's not the case. And I think that's where this somewhat false impression comes from in Anglo-Saxon countries specifically, that it's women who want to get married and men don't. That's true in that specific sector of the world. And that has obviously a lot to do with the politics involved, the government, the court systems. Marriage is still a lucrative endeavor for women, and they can get a payout at the end of it. And it makes sense that women, there's no real loss to a Western woman for getting married. She's not going to lose her finances. If anything, she'll probably gain something from it if the divorce goes through. And she can, in some states, such as California, one of the most odious states out there, get lifelong alimony. So there are incentives for women to still want to be interested in marriage, and hence the lament of the departure of the cowboy and the manly man and blah, 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 blah. East Asian culture, in many ways, is quite different. Collectivism as a manifestation of human instinct is universal. I mean, you see it everywhere. You see it in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You saw it in the Hutsi and Tutsi conflict in Rwanda back in the day. I mean, totally brutal stuff. You see it everywhere. We're by nature collective beasts. We try to affiliate with tribes, and I've spent a lot of time talking about the social aspects of it, the environmental, and most recently, I talked at least partially about the psychological reasons in the Contented Irrationalist. And you'll be hard-pressed to find cultures that are more collectivist than some of the East Asian, in particular South Korean and Japan, who many of these cultures base a lot of their current societal and cultural mores on Confucianism, specifically Neo-Confucianism, which is neo implying new. It's a newer version of it. So you're going to find extremely still conservative values of a different sort of conservative, of course, in places like South Korea and Japan. More so in South Korea, which is by far the most conservative country in East Asia, much more so than Japan, despite what people might believe, and certainly a lot more so than mainland China and even Taiwan. What happened in China was, with the Maoist Revolution, a lot of the idiosyncrasies and the older ideas about Confucianist devotion and what have you got thrown out the window and replaced by the Marxist regime and Marxist policies. And these didn't really mesh very well because, once again, people think I don't think Marxism exists. Proof otherwise. I mean, certainly in the writings of Marx, which I've never finished reading, and some of the others, there is a desire to split the family. I don't attribute it to some foreboding satanic figure like some of these people, but that's there. And Confucianist policies maintain a strict adherence to familial ties, no matter what. I mean, you hate each other and you stick together no matter what. I mean, it's not, Stephen Moyeu's de fou or whatever. That doesn't apply to the Confucianist mindset. A little background here I'm giving you. So you don't really have that in mainland China. Places like Taiwan, kind of, and certainly in South Korea and Japan. Japan is often in the spotlight, still very conservative overall. But why is marriage in decline in these countries by way of contrast to Western countries? Because there are subtle but different reasons. And believe it or not, more women in Asian countries such as South Korea and Japan, or rather fewer women, want to get married than men. More men want to get married in these countries. And there are a couple of reasons for this. There was never the sort of feminist liberation movement, even though feminism certainly has taken hold in these countries to a degree, that took place in the West, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon countries, which is really a phenomenon to itself. You could do a research paper on why feminism was so strong in the Anglosphere. It has influence, but it hasn't had this decades-long build-up infiltration. And because Neo-Confucianism is still such a strong current in both South Korean and Japanese culture, for example, these two countries being the most prominent of the decline in marriage countries in Asia, you're going to have natural resistance. The grass eater phenomenon, I think, is incorrectly assessed as some sort of rejection of feminism, because a lot of people try to paint a very broad brush and say, well, it's feminism infiltrating the country. No. I think grass-eating men are essentially rejecting the dictates of a Neo-Confucianist society. When one of the primary dictates of this familial collective organization and adherence principle of Neo-Confucianism is, do or die, you stick with the family, and, duty above all else. I mean, that's going to motivate you to possibly seek greener pastures elsewhere. And the kinds of work some of these guys do, the hours they put in, I mean, it makes Americans look like they're on vacation, and particularly Europeans look like they're on permanent holiday. I mean, these guys bust their ass. They're not very content. I mean, assuming they follow these traditional roles that they've been assigned. So that I think more than anything else, particularly in Japan, explains the grass eater phenomenon. It's more a reaction to Neo-Confucianist principles just kind of sucking, for the individual at least, than anything else. On the other hand, as I said, fewer women want to get married than men overall across the board in Asia. And that's an interesting phenomenon in itself. And we take the time to study male motivation. I find women's motivation interesting too. I don't blame them, frankly, the women. Because in the Neo-Confucianist mindset, the woman has the duty to the family and has to fulfill a lot of obligations as well. She doesn't want to be part of that. It doesn't make her happy. I certainly understand that position. And unlike the West, you don't have this institutionalized cash cow divorce policy. Yes, you can get things like alimony, but it's not this complex. It's not a divorce. It's not a military-industrial complex. It's not a divorce industrial complex. It's nothing like that of the sort of thing that you find, curiously, almost exclusively in these Anglo-Saxon countries in the West. And so you can't get married with the assurance that you're going to get a payout if it doesn't work out in the end. And regardless, you're stuck with familial obligations. And more women don't want children either. I mean, women in this respect, if they have to choose between their own personal freedom, their desire not to be chained down and then not have children and work, they'll actually choose that option. And they're showing that in places like Japan and South Korea. Yeah, you'll still get the traditional setup. I mean, these Neo-Confucianistic values are very solidified there, and it's going to take a long time to wear away at that, if they ever go away. But by and large, you see an abdication of marriage on the part of women far more so in the East because of that. Marriage, quite frankly, in the East is more burdensome to women than it is in the West. They get very few of the fringe benefits that Western women do and have received, and so there's no motivation really to get married. Whereas in the West, you're more or less guaranteed some kind of payout if it doesn't work out, and you can kind of afford the sloppiness of decision making that a lot of Western women engage in when entering into a marriage contract. It's far more a rejection of traditional values that are in some respects very oppressive. I mean, observing the way children operate there and the way adults work, people aren't really happy and not very content with that setup. And so, of course, it makes sense to not accept that, be you a grass-eating man or some woman who wants to do her own thing and not get married. Sure, there are women who still get married, and there's still men that do. But the decline of marriage is, of course, universal, but has different causes at these different poles of the globe, and it is actually a cultural difference in this case. I mean, if the United States, the gods forbid, were set up on Neo-Confucianistic principles, I probably would have killed myself a long time ago. But you would see a similar phenomenon there, and vice versa. If Western Greco-Roman principles had been the building blocks of Japanese and South Korean culture, then you'd see something similar there as well. People react to the environment, and women are very reactive and responsive to the environment. It all depends what the environment is. And in the case of East Asia, that environment is very different. In that environment, once again, think about security and think about risk. Marriage is actually less secure and more risky than working and not getting married, and so women go that route. So despite the cultural differences, women actually follow a predictable route. All in all, just that route is different in response to the different historical and cultural background there. Women would rather work and be independent and sacrifice, say, marriage and children because it's quite onerous for them there, whereas it's kind of a cakewalk for women in the West. And that explains, to my mind, and based on what I've read about this numerous times, as well as my own background involved in this, the primary reason why we see a decline in marriage in the East, and particularly more and more women opting out more so than men. And of course, both Japan and South Korea are suffering immensely from a decline in birth rates, and both governments have incentivized married couples to have children. They're paying people to fucking pop out kids. And both countries are facing this overall demographic decline. Both countries are not very heavy on immigration. I'm not going to touch the immigration issue here. And the reasons for this are fairly simple. I mean, believe me, if you had grown up in a Neo-Confucianist environment, you probably wouldn't be the happiest John out there. And whether you're a man or a woman, albeit for slightly different reasons. And it makes sense that given Western influence, I mean, if there hadn't been a Western influence in the Eastern countries, maybe this could have been avoided. But we live in the age of the internet, of international communication, and word spreads like wildfire. And lo and behold, people get wind of the quote-unquote freedoms that we have in the West, and they might want to share in them too. All the while against this historical backdrop of Neo-Confucianism, of very strong traditional principles, which have been there for several hundreds of years in the case of Neo-Confucianism, and thousands, and in the case of South Korea, going back beyond that. That's hard to break, but we will continue to see this decline, albeit for different reasons. Now, there is still the tradition there. I mean, marriage and marriage there is done very much by the books. It's based on, standard human policies of, woman has to look pretty, man has to earn money and provide resources. And for the most part, I mean, you have things in South Korea such as son. Son is a term for an arranged date, usually set up by parents or relatives or friends in order to pawn off two people in order for them to get married. And it's very much done by the books in terms of men resources and women attractiveness. And they don't really try to fool around with this romance notion too much with respect to that, for those who still get married, but it's on the decline. What the end result of all this might be globally, I don't know. But I find the transformation that East Asia is partaking in particularly fascinating. Remember, these are Japanese and Korean in particular. I mean, these are languages where where honorifics are morphologically codified into the language. I mean, you cannot make a statement in either Japanese or Korean without indicating your position, rank, high in the hierarchy with respect to someone else. And how you address that person will depend on who he is and who you are and what you want to say. Maybe you want to insult him, maybe not. So that's going to be very difficult to get rid of. But I don't blame women. I wouldn't want to be in that situation either. And so most women who then opt out of marriage, they would prefer just to work and do their own thing, albeit for slightly different reasons, and certainly they have different motivations. Do I think if you had some sort of institutional transformation, the likes of which we see or have seen in the West and Western Anglophony, you probably would see an increase in desire for marriage because you would have that government bailout for the female, but that's not likely to happen. So women would rather just earn their own keep and leave marriage alone for the most part, the ones who are partaking in the decline. And I think we'll continue to see more and more of that. But important cultural differences, we have a tendency to over-apply certain rules of cause and effect, and I think here with regards to this phenomenon, it's somewhat different. Anyway, two interesting articles that I'll be posting below. You can check them out. Both of them cover this topic, and I will see you guys later. Everyone take care.